We are honored and delighted to have Bill Emmott as our guest speaker tonight. Mr. Emmott is particularly well known for his association with the weekly London-based newspaper, The Economist. He has served as the newspaper's correspondent in Brussels and for many years in Tokyo, and was also an economic correspondent based in London. After serving in a number of editorial positions, in 1993 he became editor-in-chief, a position he occupied until March of this year. In his long 13-year reign, The Economist more than doubled its readership to approximately 1.1 million readers, a development that he has modestly attributed to the effects of rapid globalization. Others, however, have been quick to point out and to credit his high journalistic and editorial standards. Mr. Emmott is also the author of 6 books, 4 of them on Japan. One of them, The Sun Also Sets, The Limits of Japan's Economic Power, became a bestseller in Japan. His most recent book, The Sun Also Rises, which is an expanded version of his recent survey article in The Economist, is also becoming a bestseller. He's now researching a book on the emerging political-economic relationship among Japan, China, and India. And in each of his books, indeed in all of his writing, Mr. Emmott brings a remarkable depth of interdisciplinary and geographic knowledge, as well as a deep appreciation for the effects of history and contemporary and future political economic trends. So please join me in welcoming tonight Bill Emmott.
Well, thank you. I knew that was going to happen. Thank you very much for such a kind... I think I might turn mine off. Maybe this one is now going to work. Can you all hear me at the back? Lovely. I wouldn't want you to miss anything. Thank you. Having mastered the technology, let me resume my thanks for that very, very kind introduction, and for all of you doing me the honor of coming here today. And I'm particularly honored and slightly awed by being the first speaker in a series described as the Distinguished Speaker Series. The combination of those things, particularly as journalists don't typically use the word distinguished next to their names, is liable to go to one's head slightly. But I am reminded of one of Henry Kissinger's best one-liners, in which once when he was asked, Dr. Kissinger, what's it like to be famous? His answer was, the great thing about being famous is that you can bore people and they think it's their fault. I'm also especially pleased that this is such an interdisciplinary group and that the whole concept of this series is interdisciplinary. As Dr. McLachlan said, that really is the root of a lot of what I try to do, but also very much has been the root over 163 years of what The Economist has been about. That title, The Economist, is one of the most grossly misleading names in world journalism, being a magazine not about economics, but rather about everything, about political economy, blending together economics and politics, taking a broad view of what needs to be thought about. And that very much is what I hope to do for you today. The origin of The Economist is also a relationship with Asia, and I just want to mention that at the start of this as well. The founder of The Economist was a Scottish businessman called James Wilson, who had a business making beaver skin hats. Possibly we ran out of beavers, but nevertheless he decided to found a publication campaigning for free trade in the 1840s, in 1843, but then went into politics, joined a liberal government, and then got sent out to India as finance minister in imperial India. And while there, he founded a bank called the Chartered Bank of India and East Asia, which is now called the Standard Chartered Bank. And if you go to their building in Hong Kong and happen to see a rather large, black, glowering Victorian statue there looming down at you, that is our founder. He was a slightly humorless fellow by reputation. He died quite young in Calcutta, and it is said that his last words were, "Please look after my income tax." Admittedly, he was talking about the tax that he'd founded rather than the money that he owed, but nevertheless, I hope we've lightened up a little bit over 160 years. Now, to get down to business, my plan this afternoon is to try to address essentially 4 questions. Is Japan and its economy really recovering? Secondly, what effect might that recovery or the state of Japan's economy have on Japan's relationship with its neighbors, which has been a particularly fractious one in recent years? What effect, more broadly, might that economic change have on Japan's diplomacy and the domestic politics in Japan of that diplomacy, and therefore, more broadly, what sort of future shape of Asia might a more confident, recovering Japan contribute to? This also leads us, of course, inevitably into some contemporary questions as well as rather more general ones of North Korea, of Prime Minister Abe's visit to China recently and the attempt to improve relationships between Japan and China, and, of course, the whole history issue, as it's known in the region, and the difficult questions of the Yasukuni war shrine and all of that. And most important, it is all going to be a precursor to answering your questions at the end of this lecture, and that, to me, is very much the most important part of the afternoon when I get to hear what you're interested in. So I very much look forward to that. So, first of all, is Japan really recovering? Is the revival of the Japanese economy a genuine one? I think this really divides into 2 parts. Is the recovery sustainable? And is it actually, looking ahead 5 to 10 years, going to be a vigorous recovery, a vigorous economy? Or is Japan doomed to be burdened by, in particular, the impact of an aging society, of demographic problems? I think that it is a sustainable recovery, and I actually also think that it'll be surprisingly vigorous during the next 10 years. I think that a way to think about Japan's economic history in the last 20 years or 25 years is roughly as follows. During the 1980s, when I was a correspondent in Tokyo, and Japan was the economy that everyone thought was taking over leadership from America, it was the sort of juggernaut rolling into the other rich countries. Japan was essentially rather like an athlete on steroids. It was a fantastic athlete, but it had performance-enhancing drugs, namely a financial inflation which appeared to make the cost of capital zero, which enabled Japanese companies to start buying up assets in the United States, Rockefeller Center, Pebble Beach Golf Course, Columbia Pictures and all of that, enabled Japanese companies to expand abroad more generally, and to overinvest in Japan as well, ramped up the growth rate in Japan, but then led to the stock market and property market crashes that began in 1990 and really got going around 1992, 1993. But then Japan in the 1990s became a different sort of competitor. It became really, I think, still an athlete, still an impressive performer, but an athlete carrying weights, or perhaps more relevantly for me, since I'm at the end of a 2-week travel, an athlete suffering from jet lag. Now, in this decade, and with the economy having had 4 years of recovery, 4 years of growth, I would say that the fundamental strengths of that athlete, of that high-performing economy, are now going to come through again and are beginning to be seen. The strengths of a really rather good education system, despite evidence of some decline in it, an education system that equips the mass of the labor force in Japan to a much higher level than is typical either in the United States or in Western Europe, certainly than in Britain. The technological advancement that was driving Japan in the 1980s has carried on with a high level of research and development, 3.5% of GDP being spent on that, which is the highest in the OECD countries. The sort of social stability and order for which Japan is famous, and I think the ability of Japanese companies to organize themselves and manage themselves in a very disciplined way. These strengths are going to come through. During the 1990s, of course, people became disillusioned with Japan and became preoccupied with the problems and with the notion that somehow perhaps we had always been wrong about the true strengths of the Japanese economy. I like to think that although, of course, Japan's strengths were exaggerated by a lot of people during the 1980s, that Japan was never as flawless and efficient a place as it was cracked up to be, nevertheless there's been an overshoot in the opposite direction, rather parallel to the sort of overshoot that happened concerning the United States in the 1930s during its Great Depression. An evaluation of the American economy made in 1935 or 1938 would have produced a wholly misleading estimation of the potential of the American economy ahead of that, and in particular, it would have led you to misunderstand what was going to happen in the 1950s in America. And so it is, I think, with Japan that the trends of the 1990s are not a good guide to how Japan's going to perform over the next decade or more. During the last 4 to 5 years, the burdens, the weights that this athlete was carrying have been shed. And those burdens were 3 excesses: excess debt, the non-performing loans that had been built up because of the property crash and then because of the long period of stagnation, in an insolvent banking system that was for a long time in a state of denial or at least forbearance to try to avoid bringing about mass bankruptcies, the excess production capacity that had been built up in the 1980s and that needed to be mothballed but then hung over competitive structures in the economy for many years, and what emerged as excess labor that depressed wages and incomes in this environment of excess debt and excess capacity. Those 3 excesses were worked through mainly by the passage of time and by patience, but also by a series of reforms in the late 1990s and the early part of this decade. Now, there are clear signs that the economy is in a proper state of recovery, particularly the expansion of bank lending, which got underway through a net of repayments of debt over the last 6 months. Capital expenditure is leading economic growth very strongly, significantly for consumption and incomes. Full-time regular employment has been expanding since April 2005, and as a result of it, there is a modest sign at last of rising wages that should produce the ammunition or the fuel that is necessary for consumption to recover. An important question, at least if you are former Prime Minister Koizumi, is should Prime Minister Koizumi be given the credit for this recovery? And I think the answer is partly he should. A lot of the reforms, particularly to the financial supervisory system, to the control on public spending, to reforms of the commercial code and system had been put underway before he came into office, particularly under the Hashimoto government. But what Koizumi did, and in particular his economic specialist, Professor Takanaka, was actually to enforce these changes, to actually enforce the bank inspection system and supervision rules that had been already set up but hadn't actually been implemented, to further tighten the controls on public work spending, which is wasting huge amounts of capital, and, I think importantly, to bring in reforms to the labor laws in Japan, which enabled companies to expand greatly their use of part-time and temporary contract workers, a proportion of the labor force which went up from 18% of the labor force in the early 1990s to 30% by May last year. That, in turn, enabling them to cut costs, rebuild profits, and provide the wherewithal for investment. His banner projects of privatization of the Postal Savings Bank, of other state financial institutions, of the housing loan institutions, have not really had any effect yet, but they are reforms that will or may, if they are maintained and not reversed by his successors and by his party, have an effect over the next 10 to 15 years in constraining and reducing the role of the state in the economy. Yes, it is true that Japan's recovery was also fueled by strong demand for exports in China, by exporting capital goods to help with the construction of Chinese manufacturing industry and semi-finished goods and components for that very industry. But the important thing was that Japan was in fact in a position to benefit from that because of the reforms that had taken place. Now, Japan, in this recovery period, will not be invulnerable, of course. What it was in the 1990s was an economy, and hence a society, which was beset by quite exceptional problems and exceptional burdens. Now, I think the way to think of Japan is that it's an economy and a society that's beset by what you might call normal problems. No more problems than other rich countries, but equally no fewer problems than other rich countries in terms of inequality, in terms of the effect on unskilled workers of pressure of globalization, problems of the education system and the inequalities that come with that and the declining quality of it, problems, above all, of demography. Japan will be affected by an American slowdown, despite the front page of my former employer, America Drops, Asia Shops, Why the American Slowdown Won't Stop the World. It will, as the article says, affect Japan, because Japan does have net exports to the United States, and a drop in consumer demand in this country will, of course, slow down Japan's growth. But it won't knock it for six. It won't bring it to a stop, because Japan has regional demand, but also domestic demand that are acting as a support for the economy. The key factor in economic terms for the short and medium term are consumption growth, which is really driven by income growth. But in the longer term, over the next 10 years or more, demography is the most important issue. And that brings us to the question of how vigorous Japan's recovery is likely to be. Demography means that the average cost of employing a worker does go up as they get older, because they typically, even if the seniority system of paying of salaries is weakening, nevertheless, older workers do tend to get paid more in all economies, and if you have a structure that shifts in that direction, that does raise your costs. It also, of course, adds to the public burdens through public sector pensions and through medical costs. Against that, though, demography should not be considered to be destiny in an economy, because it's just one side of the calculation that really determines the trend growth of that economy. The OECD's estimates for Japan's potential growth in the rest of this decade and beyond are a function of labor force shrinkage, which is what is happening as the population declines and as people retire, and productivity growth on the other side. But in the absence of a crystal ball, what the OECD has to put into those numbers is the productivity growth that Japan has experienced over the past 15 years, over the decade of the 1990s, which was slow, 1.7% a year on average, which was well below the 2.5% to 3.5% range that the new economy of the United States brought, for example. That 1.7% growth, if projected forward, produces a rather dispiriting outlook for Japan, probably an outlook of only sort of 1.5% or slightly more annual potential growth in the economy. But that depends on the assumption that the past 10 years is a good guide to the next 10. And I would suggest that there's no reason to think that it will be. Why? Partly for the reason that I've already said, that those past 10 years were burdened with an unusual set of constraints that are no longer there. Secondly, they also were characterized by huge wastage of capital in public spending and in the support by the banking system of what came to be known as zombie companies, which were a channeling of capital to the least efficient companies in the Japanese system, but also because the opening up of the domestic economy to more competition through deregulation and through reforms to capital markets and commercial code was really only underway in the late 1990s and the early part of this decade, and therefore any benefits in terms of productivity growth from that increased competition would not be seen in those numbers. I think that a bet on vigor in Japan is really a bet on an acceleration of that annual productivity growth as the misallocation of capital comes to an end, as competition starts to exert a greater pressure. It's still not an openly competitive economy, but nevertheless there is more free competition there than before, and as Japanese companies start to put investment behind their R&D spending in much greater quantity, and then use it both to innovate in processes and products, as well as to catch up with a lot of the productivity experiences and examples of the United States during the 1990s. On that assumption, I think at least one can say that productivity growth in the next 10 years is pretty likely to be higher than productivity growth in the past 10 years. One can't know in advance how much higher, but I think there is at least a contest going to be underway between the burdens that demography put on and the push that productivity produces. Now, of course, while Japan was experiencing this economic stagnation and associated with it a degree, but not a lot, of social problems, Asia around it was changing dramatically. In economic terms, of course, China and its total economic output grew by between 3 and 4 times during that period, that 15-year period. Since 2001, India has been accelerating its rate of economic growth from what used to be called the Hindu rate of growth, the 5% or so, which really kept incomes per head stagnant or falling in a country of fast population growth, to the current levels of 8 or 9%. And at the same time, along with this growth of China and with the associated growth in the rest of the region as well, Asia was building sort of embryonic institutions of community cooperation, such as the ASEAN, or Asian now, Regional Forum in security, developing the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and extending it to what is known as ASEAN Plus 3, adding Japan, China, and Korea to the discussions, extending operations and collaboration into financial areas in particular, with central bank swap arrangements and the Chiang Mai Accord on financial markets, and with at least extended talk about free trade agreements. So having been a region that was characterized really by almost complete absence of regional institutions in 1990, and very much led in the security field by the United States, the region has moved on somewhat in the last 15 years, and it's got, of course, its own local security problem, namely North Korea, which, although it's come to the headlines recently, has been building up over a period of 15 years to that status, with the first accord to restrain North Korea's nuclear program in 1994, a system chaired, the Korean Economic Development Organization, chaired by the next speaker in this distinguished speaker series, Steve Bosworth, for a time, but coincident when that was set up with a planning operation in the Pentagon to look at whether it was feasible to make a military attack on North Korea in 1994 because of worries about the nuclear program. It was decided that it wasn't, and they went for containment and for a deal. But meanwhile, North Korea was developing its missiles and building up its missile capability with tests that particularly shook Japan in 1998 when a missile sailed over the Japanese archipelago, and then again, of course, earlier this year when a number of missiles were tested, and now the nuclear test. North Korea has had a particularly important effect on the Japanese politics of regional diplomacy and Japanese politics of national defense. Because as Japan's economy has been evolving in the way that I've been describing, so Japanese politics, of course, have had to change. North Korea has been the biggest influence on the defense stance of Japan, which has taken a steady, if not dramatic, set of changes towards a more active stance ever since that missile test of 1998, with laws passed to permit more peacekeeping activity beyond the previous definition of the self-defense force, with capabilities being enhanced, particularly with satellite surveillance and anti-submarine detection capability and that sort of thing. And this coinciding with the rise to power in Japan in 2001 of a man considered relatively nationalistic, namely Junichiro Koizumi. In his 5 years in office, he has been seen as exhibiting an increasingly nationalistic stance in Japanese politics, but also reflecting a rise in a form of nationalism in Japan. I would characterize it as a soft form of nationalism. It's not a hard nationalism that demands rearming or militarization, but is a soft sort of nationalism that is nervous about the rise of China, nervous about the effect on regional relationships of the rise of the Chinese military power along with its economy, that is sensitive about the prospect and present actuality of occasionally being bullied, pushed around by China, but that also, of course, is intensely nervous of North Korea, but also liable to use North Korea as a pretext. This meant that I think Prime Minister Koizumi's type of nationalistic policy as Prime Minister was really a policy of seeking to show that Japan stood tall in the face of regional pressures, which made him, I think, exhibit a certain degree of stubbornness in the face of regional criticism, in particular of his annual visits to the Yasukuni War Shrine. That stubbornness can be explained partly by the fact that he pledged during his campaign to become leader of the Liberal Democratic Party that he would visit the Yasukuni Shrine, but I don't think that's an entire explanation for his stubbornness, since if he had broken that pledge, he would hardly have been an innovator among politicians in breaking campaign pledges. One Australian politician once said to me that he thought that his campaign promises should be divided into core promises that he would stick to and the rest, which he broke. And there's no particular reason why Koizumi needed to put this as a core promise, really. So I think the second explanation, which is that he, and I suspect backed by other members of the LDP, felt that standing tall in the face of pressure was simply a good in itself, and would show Japan to be a confident, a more confident and a more resolute country, one that was willing to stick to its guns on things, stick to what it believed, and actually was no longer following a foreign policy of pusillanimousness, really, of simply trying to keep its head down and do whatever was required to live a quiet life. That also seems to me the only possible explanation for, I think, the very odd Japanese stance recently on whaling, in which Japan made a renewed effort to try to get commercial whaling permitted by the International Whaling Organization, despite the fact that I've yet to meet more than 3 Japanese citizens who actually want to eat whale meat, and the community pressing for whaling to be resumed is extremely small, and isn't even particularly powerful within the LDP, as far as I can tell. And so, in Professor Joe Nye's terms, the soft power of Japan internationally was simply squandered by this effort to try to reopen commercial whaling. But I think in the cause of establishing, by another step, Japan's shift from, if you like, a policy of being pusillanimous in diplomacy to a stance of saying, we stand for things, you can't push us around. And that was popular domestically, but also a principle that he and others wanted to make internationally. But they did so, I would say, amid a general lack of confidence economically in Japan, a lack of confidence that exacerbated the sense of vulnerability in the face of regional trends, a certain defensiveness about Japan's perceived economic and national failures of the previous decade. In fact, when I was discussing a book with a publisher in Japan in early 2005, the publisher asked me, would my book be optimistic or pessimistic? I said, well, I thought perhaps it was better to do the research first before deciding the opinion of the book. But nevertheless, why did he ask this question, I said. And his answer was, well, frankly speaking, Mr. Emmott, a pessimistic book would sell better. At that time, pessimism was, if you like, more the national mood. I turned out optimistic, as you know, and I didn't publish the book with his company either. But also, I think that the mood has changed, and now there is a greater confidence that the recovery is genuine, that it is sustainable, and that it is altering somewhat the background, the mood background to national politics. So now we have, as Prime Minister in Japan, Shinzo Abe, the son of one of the most pusillanimous foreign ministers that Japan has ever seen, Shintaro Abe, as far as I was concerned when I was there as a correspondent. He seemed to stand for nothing when he was foreign minister, and he wrote a book, essentially, listing in great detail the nothing that he stood for, as I recall. Now his son is Prime Minister and is there with a reputation for being something of a hawk, with a background of having stood tough on North Korea and spoken up for quite a vigorous policy about the abduction issue of Japanese citizens abducted by North Korea during recent decades, and with something of a history of having spoken out in favor of rather revisionist views of Japan's military role during the first half of the 20th century, and indeed of questioning the legitimacy of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal of 1947-48. He, with this background, has become Prime Minister, and his first move is to visit China and seek to improve relationships with both China and South Korea. Question: how can one put these, this background, this stand-tall nationalism, together with his initial steps, which appear to be directed towards improving relationships with the neighboring countries, who are very suspicious of him, and they know of his background, of course. How can these be reconciled, and where might this lead? There's no doubt that the last 5 years have been very bad in political terms for Japan's relationship with both China and South Korea. A bad 5 years that's had no economic impact. It's been a terrific period of economic integration between those three countries. But nevertheless, this bad mood and history and lack of any summit meeting between the Chinese and Japanese leaders since 2001 has been unhelpful in terms of putting together the six-party consensus on North Korea. It's been bad for Japan's global role and global position, undermining its candidacy for a permanent seat in the Security Council, for example, and undermining its reputation in the world too, and I think potentially harmful for any Japanese diplomats or politicians who think that Japan could in the future exert influence in the region by leading and thereby helping to shape and perhaps indeed shaping a free trade agreement that could, if you like, make the region somewhat in Japan's image. So although he has this track record and difficult background, nevertheless the problems of bad relations are clear, and they're not, and the problem of the bad relation is clearly bad for Japan's global position. So I think what's happening now and what will happen next is, I think, an attempt to try to reconcile these different characteristics. I think, first of all, there's going to be a continued effort, continuing an effort begun in the last few years under Koizumi, to try to draw India into regional relationships. With help from Singapore and the United States, Japan persuaded India to take part in the inaugural East Asia Summit in Kuala Lumpur in 2005, and persuaded other Southeast Asian countries to support that effort, very much against Chinese skepticism and reluctance to have India defined as part of East Asia and playing a part in East Asian diplomacy. Japan, like the United States, wants India to take a bigger part to prevent the region becoming centered on China, becoming overly led and dominated by China. And that effort of drawing India in is, I think, going to continue under the Abe administration. He's clearly also going to continue to take a very tough line, or pretty tough line, on North Korea. That's his background. It's also a clearly popular line in Japan. But third, I think that there are likely to be new efforts by this administration to try to, as it were, lance the boil of history, to try to at least downgrade or even remove, but I think that would be putting it too strongly, the obstacles that disputes and resentment over history and the lack of reconciliation place in the path of Japanese diplomacy. And if that proves to be true, and I'll explain why the degree to which I think it might be attempted. If it proves to be true, 2007 would be a good year to try to do it, because it's the 70th anniversary of the commencement of the Sino-Japanese War, full Sino-Japanese War of 1937. July the 7th is the 70th anniversary of the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incident, which was like the trigger that led to Japan attempting to expand its dominance, its influence in China beyond the northeast and into the rest of China. And December the 13th is the 70th anniversary of the rape of Nanking, of the atrocities in the then Chinese capital. This is also a time when China is at least keen on seeking to dampen its own public protests against Japan, trying to moderate the effect of Chinese public opinion on relations with Japan, but also on its own streets, worried about the possibility of disorder and protest during the Beijing Olympics year of 2008, but also just worried about this phenomenon generally. And Prime Minister Abe at least can be said, with his clear nationalistic credentials, to have the capability of carrying with him a large part of the ruling party in Japan to make such a move. Nobody's going to doubt that he is really a believer in, if you like, Japanese national strength and identity. But to do it would require, I think, a comprehensive approach to history, to historical reconciliation. That's going to be obviously hard for him to pull off. I think really, if it were to be done, it would have to take in 4 different strands. One strand would be reform of the Yasukuni War Shrine itself. The Yasukuni War Shrine is a problem, as many of you know, but some may not, particularly because this shrine set up by Emperor Meiji in 1869 as an official shrine to Japan's dead in all wars since 1853 is a private shrine now, a private religious entity since the separation of church and state in the post-war Japanese constitution. It's a private religious entity that took 2 private initiatives, one in 1978 to bring into the shrine 14 executed Class A war criminals and to, as it were, list them as part of the memorialized and souls in the shrine, thereby, in effect, repudiating the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, or saying that it's illegitimate. And the reason that's a repudiation is because your eligibility, conceptually, to be memorialized at the Yasukuni Shrine depends on you having died in war, having died as a military victim, whereas these 14 were executed as a part of a judicial process. So if you think the Tokyo Tribunal was an act of war, then you can include these 14. If you don't, which is the official Japanese government position accepted as a legitimate tribunal as part of the post-war settlement, then really these 14 shouldn't be there. And so bringing them in was a statement by the shrine against that, as a result of which the emperor has not visited the shrine since that date. But secondly, this private entity has set up a museum at the shrine called the Yushukan that is essentially a propaganda museum for the idea that Japan's wars ever since 1894 were all wars of liberation in Asia, and that Japan was essentially a victim rather than an aggressor. So visiting the shrine as Prime Minister in his official capacity, Koizumi essentially was taken quite rightly, I think, by China and South Korea as undermining the official position of the government, both about the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal and in terms of the apologies that have been made by previous prime ministers and by himself, repeated by himself, for the atrocities and for the invasions that Japan did during the first half of the 20th century. So I think a solution requires the status of Yasukuni to be reformed such that it becomes an official shrine again, such that the 14 Class A war criminals are disenshrined, or whatever the right verb would be for that, and such that the museum is removed or reformed. And this would require a special law that would define the shrine as being essentially a non-religious religious shrine that thereby was exempt from the constitutional bar between church and state and brought the shrine back into official control. This has been proposed by the current foreign minister, Taro Aso, who has been visiting the shrine ever since his grandfather, Shigeru Yoshida, dandled him on his knee, as he puts it, at the time when the American occupation came to an end, and took him to the shrine as part of the celebration of Japan's independence. And he's been going ever since, but he has proposed that precisely this sort of reform should be made in order to get to a position in which the emperor is able to visit the shrine again and it ceases to be a big issue. It is said that there is acceptance of the need to do this from the chief priest of the shrine and from the LDP people who are closest to the War Veterans Association, which has been an important lobby group. But of course, I think we should believe it when we see it and when it's actually done, rather than just talked about. But this would have to be number one of the 4 strands of approach towards improving Japan's position related to its neighbors. The second strand has to be, I think, joint research between Chinese and Japanese scholars on history, seeking to come to a common agreement on the history, probably involving scholars from other countries as well, and seeking to emulate the sort of process that took place between France and Germany over school textbooks in the 1950s and between Poland and Germany in the 1970s. A statement that this was envisaged was included in the communique of the recent summit between Shinzo Abe and Hu Jintao. But I think it's reasonable to question whether this will actually be seriously carried out or whether it's gesture politics on both sides. It would require the Japanese side to give full independence to its historians, to offer full political backing to whatever they came up with, and to bring in scholars from other countries. Just as difficult, it would require the Chinese side to permit access to primary historical materials in China. That would, of course, be difficult because it would unlock the doors to the Communist Party's own history in China. So I think this second part of the formula, which has, at least in principle, just been agreed upon between the 2 governments, nevertheless should be greeted with quite a lot of skepticism as to whether it will really happen. And at its current form, it's pretty likely to be, if you like, a cover story to get the 2 countries through a difficult anniversary year and to cover the Yasukuni issue as well, and perhaps a temporary forbearance against visits there rather than a permanent solution. Thirdly, I think you would have to have a reopening by Japan of the issue of compensation for war victims, and in particular for categories like slave laborers and the so-called comfort women issue. And there has been no sign of flexibility by the Japanese government, either the previous one or the present one, on those issues, still sticking to the position that these were settled in the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1951. And fourth, I think what would be required would be what is known as a Willy Brandt moment, a deep and sincere and demonstrative apology, an expression of remorse on one of the anniversaries of this coming 2007 year, of which I think the best one would be December the 13th in Nanjing. So that would be what the package should be. I think there is a chance that the Yasukuni issue may be dealt with. I don't think there's much chance that either there will be a serious joint study of history or the compensation issue will be dealt with. I think that there's a possibility that perhaps not a Willy Brandt type initiative of the sort that he did in bowing down and shedding tears about the relationship, about Germany's history in the 20th century, but that something bigger could be done by this clearly nationalist Prime Minister, if he is still Prime Minister, in December of next year. With this effort, at least tentatively underway, and with Japan's economy recovering as it is, what future is there for Asia? Briskly to close this lecture. It is the first time when there's been in Asia both a strong Japan and a strong China in history, and I think we now must add to that an emerging India, which is expanding its interests and its exposure as its economy grows and as its global ambitions grow. So Asia is moving into a period of balance of power politics between these three great powers, plus, very importantly, the United States. They are generating common interests that could form a proper agenda for regional institutions, as and when some of these obstacles are dealt with, in trade, over the environment, already over counter-terrorism and piracy issues. It's less clear that they can or will really have regional discussions of any meaningful nature over security and defense, given some of the issues about Taiwan and North Korea and other things that are there. But nevertheless, the flow towards an eventual East Asian community or Asian community involving these three great powers is, I think, at least underway. It leaves us with big questions. Will India genuinely emerge and become an Asian country rather than a South Asian country? Might North Korea collapse under the tensions and stresses put on both by its internal difficulties and by the sanctions regime? How might China deal with the issue of political change as an affluent middle class emerges in that country, demanding protection of its rights, of its property rights, demanding greater accountability and a proper rule of law? And how, of course, can Taiwan be dealt with, reconciled with, resolved as this whole process develops? I don't have answers to any of those questions, but the good news is that the questions are still there, which means that journalists and scholars will have a lot of work to do in the coming years, and hopefully you will have a lot of questions about both Japan and the region now in the time we have remaining. So I'd like to thank you for listening to me patiently, as you have, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much. Who would like to begin? Sir.
Can you discuss the future of Japanese Brazilians living in Japan and Koreans living in Japan?
Well, let me put it in a broader context of immigration first.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, okay. The question was, could I discuss the future of Japanese Brazilians living in Japan and of Japanese Koreans living in Japan? That was the question, wasn't it? And I said, I think that I should discuss it in the context of Japanese attitudes to immigration, because I think that is part of the issue, but not, of course, the whole issue. The framework, I think, for the question should be an answer to a different question. Is Japan going to open up to more immigration? And I think particularly under the pressure of demography, of the aging labour force and of the shrinking population? And I think the right answer to that is no, or at least it's pretty unlikely, because I think that the social taboo about immigration, the sense that Japan's coherence and social order, it would be threatened by large-scale immigration, remains very strong. And so I don't think that it's reasonable to predict a change of policy towards immigration, even if it's been included in all sorts of wise man commission reports in recent years. I just don't think it's very credible that that's going to change. As a result, I think that the discriminatory and somewhat socially awkward situation for existing minority groups in Japan, both immigrant ones and long-time citizen ones, I think is going to continue to be difficult, and I don't think that is likely to improve a lot. There have been efforts, it's true, to increase the immigrant population by bringing in compatible immigrants, such as Japanese Brazilian descendants from the Brazilian, the emigration of Japanese to Brazil in the early 20th century, and quite a lot of people came during both the 80s and the 1990s from that. But I think that they have found life pretty awkward in Japan, and I think that they will continue to. And they've tended to be there in the more unskilled, less protected parts of the labour force. They've tended to be among those who have suffered from low wages under the new labour laws that have produced a two-tier labour force. And so I think that their situation is likely to continue to be quite difficult.
Having a point of view about the service kind of economy like we have in the U.S., 70% GDP probably is not a good measure for us because we make less copper and hard goods and stuff. Are they experiencing a shift toward more services and less goods?
Yes, they are, but not to the degree that America is. I mean, that in America, I think the figure for manufacturing is about 15% of output and about 10% of the labor force. So the rest is essentially services, agriculture, and the public sector. In Japan, I think the figure is now between 25 and 20% of the economy is manufacturing. That's down from the high 20s at the beginning of the 1990s. So there has been a shift away from manufacturing, but more gentle than in the United States. And I think that the strength of Japan's position as a neighbor to the fast-growing economy of China, as, if you like, the high-tech end of a manufacturing value chain, as the horrible phrase puts it, will keep that reasonably high, I think, in Japan. Now, Japan has a very big and active service sector, of course, but I think manufacturing is likely to subsist there as a big part of the economy for longer than it has in the United States. By the way, in the United States, one of the most compelling statistics, I think, in this is that, in fact, manufacturing output in the United States in value terms is higher now than it was 10 years ago. It's just smaller as a proportion of the economy. So the decline is to some degree exaggerated. It's a relative decline rather than an absolute decline. So, Tracy.
What new role do you see for the United States in respect to the configuration of forces that you have described in Asia?
Well, I think that the U.S. has been like the ring holder in Asian security, and it's been like the arbitrator that no one was entirely comfortable with, but everyone wanted because they were uncomfortable with the alternative. I think actually that's going to continue, but in a more complex situation when you've got two emerging big powers of China and India playing an increasing role. I think America probably will, relatively speaking, step back, but unless India really became in a major way a participant in the region, I think a lot of the smaller countries in the region are going to be very desperate to keep America in, because although they absolutely think they're benefiting from Chinese growth, they don't want Asia to become a wholly Sino-centric system. So I think that the US is going to continue to be a pretty important part of Asia. It's probably going to be encouraging this bringing in of India further, and of trying to help Japan play a bigger role by maybe encouraging it to deal with some of these history issues. But I would say a reasonable bet is that 2020 we'll still be talking about the possible future disengagement of America from Asia, because it won't have done so.
And do you see that discussion happening within the context of a new security arrangement?
I don't see
regional security arrangement?
I don't see a likely replacement security arrangement for as long as you have very incompatible political systems, and in particular the issue of Taiwan there. And perhaps, I suppose, you have to put as well the issue of North Korea. As long as you still have those two that prevent China wishing to participate in anything collective, because they don't want any restraints over their issue of Taiwan, and makes everyone scared as hell on North Korea, and so wanting to have 30,000 American soldiers within shouting distance of the DMZ as the primary barrier there, and of course the Okinawa bases, I think that you're not going to have a replacement security system. A lot of talk about it, sort of security yakking, but not security action, I suspect. So,
do you see the Japanese changing their constitution to formalize the military?
It's like in most countries, or changing the constitution is pretty difficult in Japan. It requires sort of supermajorities, and it requires referendum. And so the barriers to changing it are pretty high, and therefore I think that it's unlikely, except if there was a really sort of clear and present danger from North Korea. I think it's pretty unlikely that an attempt to get it revised would actually succeed. It's easy to change your constitution if you're Thailand and you have a military coup, but that isn't a mechanism to be recommended for other countries. And isn't likely in Japan either. So I think it's much likelier to continue to be amended or adapted through simply statutory provisions that seek to continually sort of redefine and expand the role of the military and what they're permitted to do, rather than a full change of the constitution. There's lots of talk about it. It's no longer a taboo, but it just is quite difficult to do, and so I doubt if they could really get that majority to do it. And I think there's a lot of people in Japan who are worried about doing it. I think the same applies to the issue of would Japan go nuclear, about which there's lots more talk than there ever was before. It's now relatively respectable to propose that Japan adopts nuclear weapons inside Japanese politics and Japanese academia. But I think the likelihood of them doing it is very low. Likelihood, though, because public opinion is pretty allergic to the idea of nuclear weapons, given the history. Low also because it's unnecessary to do so, given that Japan could go nuclear probably in a matter of weeks. Less than 3 months, they'd be able to go nuclear if they had to. So there's really no necessity to do so. So again, I think actually the barriers to change are quite high. So the answer on the Constitution is no, I think. So.
What's your assessment of the real threat to Japan and North Korea, and what would North Korea have to do to cause Japan to start really worrying about it?
Well, I think that it's really an assessment of what's the real threat of North Korea to anyone. And I think that, let me put it this way. Let me start by saying, Madeleine Albright has a nice line about Kim Jong-il, that she's the most senior American official to have negotiated with North Korea in 1999. And she said that before she went there, they had this idea in their minds and in their briefings that she was there to negotiate with a crazy pervert. When she left, she knew for sure he wasn't crazy. And I think that that's the right way to think of North Korea. It's been a kind of remorseless road to the current state of the nuclear test, and it's not an irrational regime at all. It's followed a rather clear path of a certain amount of bargaining behavior, but a certain strategy towards survival. It has also, though, become a less aggressive regime in terms of actual military or intelligence activity outside of the country. It's a long time since the abductions. It's a long time since the South Korean cabinet was blown up in Rangoon in, I think it was 1982. Long time since those sorts of state terrorism acts have been done. There's been a strength, a path towards strength, but also some degree a path that's made North Korea less of an effect on neighboring countries, particularly South Korea. So I think that's the way you have to think of it. The likelihood that they would actually seek to attack Japan has to be considered very low. Now, if you were a Japanese military planner, and if you were a Japanese leader, and you saw them getting nuclear weapons, you might nevertheless not be entirely reassured by what I've just said. You would be wanting to prepare for the possibility that that might prove wrong, and that in a state of desperation or of military dispute, factionalism within North Korea, that might change. But the trend is towards North Korea becoming less of a threat in terms of its actual actions, even as it still is a nuisance by counterfeiting American dollars, through drug smuggling, and through sales of missile technology to other countries. So I think that the likely, going back to my nuclear answer just before, I think that the likely Japanese response is much more going to be towards developing a preemptive strike capability, so that if there was clear signs of preparation for some sort of attack, that they would have the capability of an independent action against it, rather than the nuclear issue, because after all, they're under the American nuclear umbrella anyway. So there's an added reason why they wouldn't bother with that. So, to sum it up, I think that they don't feel under very imminent attack, but they do think that where theoretically it's possible. And of course, you have to think about what might happen if the regime collapsed. And when we think about regime collapse and the idea of reunification of the Korean Peninsula, I think we're all a little bit too sort of gulled by the experience of East and West Germany. Peaceful collapse, led by immigrants sort of fleeing East Germany, and then basically the soldiers deciding to let it go, and all because the sponsor of East Germany, the Soviet Union, was itself in a state of turmoil and collapse. And so that's a benign unification that produced economic problems, but not social, military, or political problems. I can't see any reason why a collapse of the regime in North Korea should be assumed to be like that at all. There wouldn't be a collapse taking place because of a loss of a sponsor or problems there. It would be internal problems strictly. Very large military. You would be likely to get a power struggle of some sort to try to succeed, as it were, the collapsing regime. That could be violent, and then could lead to behavior that damaged other countries.
Implications for Japan on this kind of part-time employment?
Well, I think that, yes, you're right that as it were, the strong view of productivity being a savior also means that it's bad for incomes, because if all the gains from productivity go to profits and not to wages, then you don't get the consumption right. So that is a possible outcome. Now, I think that what Japan has got is a two-tier labor force that is exacerbating inequality, which has become a political issue in Japan in the last 3 years. Fundamentally, it's for the same reason as we worry about inequality in the United States and we worried about it in Western Europe, namely the effect on unskilled labor of the vast increase in labor supply represented by India and China entering the world economy and competition there. So that's a fundamental reason for it, but it's exacerbated by the inequality of conditions for the part-time and irregular workers in Japan relative to the full-time ones. An inequality of conditions in terms of their rights to protection against dismissal, but also pensions and health protection of certain extra sorts and welfare support. And I think that where policy is going to have to be directed, and there's talk about it already, is towards equalizing the protection. But of course that's going to be resisted by employers who don't want to lose this cheap labour pool, and it's going to be resisted by the 70% of the labour force who are in the more privileged part, because I'm sure the pressure is going to be to level down rather than to level back up. So I think it's going to be quite difficult to do that. There is sort of effort to try to improve education and training for these part-time and temporary workers, and to give them sort of, as it were, lifelong learning. That's probably a more likely policy actually to be implemented because it doesn't challenge any kind of vested interest. But I do think that there's going to be an attempt to try to bring them together, because employers clearly want to maintain this division and this sort of pool. What you're seeing in the labour market is interesting in Japan, which is that even though employment has gone up, even though full-time jobs have begun to be created, actually incomes haven't been rising all that much. And one reason for that is because the labour force has been growing, because many people had left the labour force and were not being counted and have now been encouraged to come back. So labour supply is actually expanding for a while in response to the higher demand. Secondly, I think that there's going to be a lot of attention given to the use of women in companies and the productivity that can be gained by improving qualitatively the promotion opportunities and employment conditions for the female labour force. Like that's a third category, if you like, although it overlaps a lot with the part-time and temporary. A lot of those are women. And the Japanese problem there is not participation, because actually Japan has a pretty high female labour force participation rate by international standards, but it's the quality of participation, particularly for people who have left better track jobs when they went away and had children, and then are unable to return to a proper path of high quality employment. And that is, of course, an underused resource. And if Japan moves into a labour shortage situation, then there's going to be a big incentive on companies to try to exploit that bit of the labour force. So I think there's going to be attention given to that as well, gradually, not immediately. More questions?
Touching on the same subject of population, how much will Japan rely on immigration as far as in supporting the population now?
Well, I think it was really the answer that I gave to the gentleman earlier about Brazilians and Koreans. I think that the answer is not much. I think that the social and hence political resistance to immigration remains very strong in Japan. There may be some, as there has been, relaxation of the barriers in very special categories, particularly in the healthcare sector, to try to get in nurses from the Philippines and so forth, and care of the elderly within that long-term healthcare sector. But I don't think it's going to be on a large scale, for the reasons I say. You know, a Japanese joke about this, if that word is right, is that you know, the alternative solutions to population are essentially robots, women, or foreigners. And as they say, there's a lot to be said for robots. I don't agree with that. I would like to emphasize. Any more questions over here?
I have a question about the success of Japanese brands in the past. Do you think there's any particular characteristic of Japanese society that caused it, and how do you see that in the future?
So I didn't quite get the start. The success of Japanese banks, you said?
Brands.
Oh, brands. Sorry, yes, yeah. And is there a particular
characteristic of their society which caused it, and how do you see the success of their brands in the future?
Yes, the question was, how do I see the success of Japanese brands in commercial life? Is there a particular social characteristic that explains the success of Japanese brands like Sony and so forth, and Toyota, and how do I see it going in the future? Well, I think, the basic success of Japanese brands is to do with quality, and the reputation for reliability and quality, and then for sort of technological state-of-the-art. That really is what sort of was captured, particularly quality in terms of the automobile brands, and quality and technological lead in terms of the consumer electronics brands. Do they arise from a social characteristic? I think they do arise from where the ability to organize people in a disciplined way for a collective activity, namely working in a factory in a company, and thereby to achieve levels of quality and reliability that were much higher than in the United States or Western Europe. There's a lot of speculation and kind of hand-wringing now about whether that reputation is now disappearing, as even Toyota has had to recall quite a large number of cars because of some quality problems. The famous Sony exploding laptop batteries are being pretty devastating to that company's reputation, and there have been others. So there's a sort of anguishing about whether the quality standards of Japanese manufacturing are in decline, and hence whether there might be social reasons for that. I'm skeptical about that. I suspect that the truth is, maybe this is the cynical journalist in me coming out, that what we're having is more disclosure of problems rather than more problems. Now, of course, exploding laptop batteries are pretty difficult to cover up in the past. But nevertheless, some of the other problems, I think that actually that we're seeing more transparency than there was. So, which is a way of saying that I think it was a bit exaggerated in the past, but nevertheless, in relative terms, they were still higher quality. I don't think that there is really evidence that overall there's been a decline either in the social background to quality, i.e. the ability to organize in companies, although possibly the shift to temporary part-time workers for blue-collar jobs might have started to erode that in some sectors. But also, I think, in relative terms, they're still pretty good. And therefore, I think that will sort of defend the position of Japanese brands. Where they're probably weakened is in the innovativeness of the brands within consumer electronics. In particular, they're obviously battling with Korean brands, increasingly even with some Western European brands. And I think a major Japanese missed opportunity in the last 10 years was in mobile telecoms, both in the handsets and in the services. And that suggests something of a lag in innovation and some lack of really taking a global position rather than a domestic proprietary position. In mobile telecoms, Japan is the place where my mobile phone won't work, and that's because of the proprietary system that they set up there, just now changing as we get to third-generation telephony. But that restricted, I think, the ability of Japanese companies to use the domestic market as then the base to build global capability and brands in that sector. And so that's eroded their position of those companies in obviously a fantastically big sector. So I think you're going to see it being chipped away. There's more competition for them, but it's not going to disappear altogether. And our Master of Ceremonies is stood up, so therefore I think I should stand up.
I think in the interest of continuing the conversation in a more informal setting, we would like to invite you to join us for wine and soft drinks and hopefully some good food. But before we do that, I'd like to thank Bill Emmott for his wonderful insights into contemporary Japan and Asian relations, and please come and see us again.
I will. Thank you. Thank you.